So as we heard in Mark's gospel, very simple. Jesus was led out into the desert and he was tempted. We know that Mark was the first of the gospels written. We know that Mark's gospel was used by the authors of Matthew's gospel and Luke's gospel as one of their sources, but they brought in other sources as well, and that's where we get those three temptations and the interactions between the devil and Jesus that the story kind of gets broadened. But very simply, in Mark, he just wanted them to know Jesus was led out into the desert and he was tempted. If you remember, a few years ago, Pope Francis had announced that there was a better way for us to pray the Lord's Prayer. That part where we pray, lead us not into temptation. When we stop and think about it, that's a bad theology. That God does not lead us into temptation. And if in praying that over the decades we have gotten the idea that that's what God does, God is testing us, he said, no, that's not correct. He said a more accurate expression would be, do not let us fall into temptation. But it's never been officially, promulgated. I don't know when or if it is going to be. But it's good for us to remember the difference. There is a difference between saying God leads us into temptation, and so we beg him not to, and simply saying temptation is a reality. And we say to God, do not let us fall into temptation. Give us your help. There was a bumper sticker way back when, 70s or 80s or whatever, and it said, lead us not into temptation. We can find our way there ourselves just fine. And isn't that true in so many ways? A very overweight man decided that it was time to shed a few pounds. He went on a new diet and took it seriously. He even changed his usual driving route on the way to the office precisely in order to avoid the passing of his favorite bakery. One morning, however, he arrived at the office carrying a large, heavily frosted, calorie-laden coffee cake. For this, he was roundly chided by his coworkers, but he only smiled, shrugged his shoulders, and said, "What could I do? This is a very special cake." What happened was, by force of habit, I accidentally drove by the bakery this morning, and there in the window were trays of the most tempting goodies I've ever seen. Well, I felt that maybe I was meant to pass this way. So I prayed, "Lord, if it is your will for me to have one of those delicious coffee cakes, let me find a parking spot right in front of the bakery." And sure enough, on the 9th time around the block, there it was. We have a tendency to do that so very often. Rationalize, talk ourselves out of it, say, "Oh, this really isn't that bad," or "I don't drink that much or that often," or, whatever it might be. There's a level of denial that Lent is supposed to help us to face and move beyond. to look at our temptations, see them for what they really are. And maybe ask the question rather than, well, why can't I? Ask the question, why should I? Not just, well, what's so bad about doing that? But rather, what's good about it? If that's a temptation for me, why do I really believe that giving into it is going to help me to grow? But I know we find it hard sometimes to be honest. Many years ago, Native American youths would go away in solitude on what is called a vision quest to prepare for manhood. One such youth hiked into a beautiful valley, green with trees and bright with flowers. There he fasted and prayed. But on the third day, as he looked up at the surrounding mountains, he noticed one tall, rugged peak capped with dazzling snow. I will test myself against that mountain, he pondered. He put on his buckskin shirt, threw his blanket over his shoulders, and set off to climb the peak. When he reached the top, he gazed out from the rim of the world. He could see forever, and his heart swelled with pride. Then he heard a rustle of leaves at his feet, and looking down, he saw a slithering snake. Before he could move, the snake spoke. "I'm about to die," whispered the snake. "It's too cold for me up here. I'm freezing. There's no food and I'm starving. Put me under your shirt where I will be warm and take me down to the valley." "No," said the youth. "I'm forewarned. I know your kind. You are a rattlesnake. If I pick you up, you will bite, and your bite will kill me." "Not so," said the snake. "I will treat you differently. If you do this for me, you will be special to me, and I will not harm you." The youth resisted a while, but this was a very persuasive snake with beautiful diamond markings. At last, the youth tucked the snake under his shirt and carried it down to the valley. Then he placed it gently on the grass. Suddenly, the snake coiled, rattled, and struck, biting the youth on the leg. "But you promised," cried the youth. And as it slithered away, the snake said, "You knew what I was when you picked me up." The ancient Indian chief who is credited with that story says, "I tell that story especially to young people who might be tempted by drugs, alcohol, or other temptations. I want them to remember the words of the snake. You knew what I was when you picked me up." This Lent, it might be very, very important for us to honestly face our temptations, our desire for God, and which one truly is greater.